David Harris, a 45-year-old FBI director with over 20 years of investigative experience, had just moved to a new neighborhood. Everything seemed ready for the peaceful life he had always hoped for before officially retiring. He had been through countless high-stakes cases, from international money laundering rings to serious intelligence leaks, but this would be his first time finding peace in a quiet suburban neighborhood. However, David's idea of peace was soon shattered one evening when he heard loud banging on his front door, as if someone was using a battering ram. The knocking didn't stop and his heart began to race. At first, David thought he was just tired after a long day at work. But when the banging continued, he felt something was off. He knew he had to open the door and find out what was going on. As he walked toward the door, the tension began to build. He stepped over unpacked boxes and half-assembled furniture, feeling as though time was moving too slowly. He had only been in the neighborhood for less than a month, a brief period compared to the many years of work he had known. His possessions were still scattered around, and he had yet to finish settling in. But before he could complete his task, he was faced with an unexpected situation. When he opened the door, David found himself face to face with two men dressed in navy blue uniforms, each wearing a gold emblem on their chest that read, "Neighborhood Enforcement." They stood rigidly, fists clenched at their sides, their expressions cold and unfriendly. One was short, stocky, and had a salt-and-pepper mustache. The other was tall and thin, with sharp eyes behind wire-framed glasses. There was something unsettling about them. The gold emblems on their uniforms were too shiny, too large, more like costumes than official badges. "Can I help you?" David asked in his calmest, most neutral tone, trying to maintain control of the situation. He knew that a polite and composed approach would help him handle things better. "We're from the HOA police," the tall one said, adjusting his glasses and forcing a smile. "We've received multiple complaints that you are not in compliance with our yard maintenance standards. This is a formal warning." David raised an eyebrow, his suspicion growing. "Yard maintenance standards?" he repeated, unable to hide his disbelief. His lawn was barely a few inches tall, and he had only just moved in. Since when did the HOA have the authority to send police officers to someone's door for something like this? "Quite serious, huh?" David replied, crossing his arms. "You say this is a formal warning?" "It is," the mustache man chimed in. "We are authorized to issue citations, fines, and if necessary, proceed with enforcement." The directness of his threat made David feel uneasy. Usually HOA issues were handled through polite letters or emails, not by sending uniformed officers to intimidate homeowners. David stood there, his mind racing. From when had HOA gotten the authority to send police officers, much less threaten fines over a lawn? Something didn't feel right. These two men didn't look like the typical HOA enforcers. "I'd like to see the specific clause in the HOA bylaws that authorizes such enforcement," David said, keeping his tone steady. "Perhaps you could show me your IDs or business cards. I don't recall seeing either of you at the last association meeting." They exchanged a quick glance and the mustache man cleared his throat. "IDs are privileged," he said, his voice growing tense. "We have official documents, but they're not for your eyes. We have the authority to issue a $1,000 fine for noncompliance." David inhaled deeply, letting the silence linger in the air. He didn't respond immediately, instead letting the weight of their words hang in the space between them. His hand twitched, itching to reach for the badge he carried everywhere. Revealing his real credentials could easily scare them off, but it might also blow his cover. He wanted to see how far these imposters would go. "That's a stiff fine for something as trivial as a lawn, don't you think?" David said, feigning concern. "Rules are rules," the tall one replied, his voice more confident now, as if proud of how official he sounded. "We suggest you pay it right away. We'll collect it in person to spare you any hassle." David leaned against the doorframe, his mind processing the situation. He had seen enough of these scams throughout his career. He wasn't going to let it go this easily. "How about we do this by the book, gentlemen?" David said calmly. "I'll need to confirm everything with the HOA board. Could you please wait here while I grab the official community guidelines? I have a copy somewhere." "We're not here to debate the bylaws," the mustache man cut him off harshly. "We're here to enforce them. Failure to cooperate means immediate suspension of your community, privileges and possible arrest." Arrest? David echoed, arching an eyebrow. That's a bit extreme, don't you think? The tall one gave David a condescending shrug. Since you signed a contract to move here, you gave us that power. Now hand over the payment or we'll escalate matters. David stepped back inside and shut the door, assuring them he would be right back with his checkbook. But in reality, he was headed for his home office, where his real FBI badge awaited. These men had no idea what they were about to face. David Harris had always prided himself on keeping his cool under pressure, a skill honed during 2 decades in the FBI. But even he couldn't deny the spike of adrenaline coursing through his veins as he closed the door on the 2 fake HOA officers. The situation was far from ordinary. The men outside weren't acting like the usual scammers who send fraudulent letters or make phone calls. These 2 had the audacity to show up at his doorstep, dressed in uniforms that looked just official enough to make anyone hesitate before questioning them. But David had spent years tracking down fraudsters and criminals, and something about them felt wrong from the start. As he made his way to his office, his mind raced. Could these men be testing him, or was this part of something bigger? He had made plenty of enemies throughout his career. Corrupt politicians, mob bosses, cybercriminals, and now it seemed someone had found his new address. The idea of someone sending imposters dressed as HOA police was too calculated to be a random scam. It was all too precise. They might have been part of something larger, maybe even part of a sting operation targeting people like him, people with high-profile careers. David's thoughts were interrupted by the familiar click of his filing cabinet lock as he retrieved his FBI badge from its secured spot. It was tempting to simply flash it in their faces, in the charade, and watch their reactions. But he wasn't sure whether they were just petty con men or if this was a larger scheme. He needed more than just their terror to stop them. He needed to gather evidence. With a quick breath, David turned on his heel and opened the door, stepping back into the confrontation. The 2 imposters were still standing there, trying to maintain their false sense of authority, though the tension between them was palpable. The man with the mustache had his arms crossed tightly, while the tall one seemed to be fidgeting nervously. "I'll tell you what, gentlemen," David said, his voice calm, measured. "You'll wait here while I make a quick call to confirm your authority with the HOA board." He tried to sound unruffled, but every second spent talking to these men felt like an eternity. He was hoping to buy time to figure out how deep this deception went. The tall man's eyes shifted quickly to his partner, then back at David. "We're not here to debate the bylaws," he said, his voice slightly shaky now. "We're here to enforce them. If you don't comply immediately, we'll suspend your community privileges and maybe even arrest you." David raised an eyebrow at the mention of arrest. "Arrest?" he echoed, genuinely surprised. Since when does an HOA have the power to arrest someone? His mind began to race. This wasn't just a case of a neighborhood scam. It was something more. They had no right to act as law enforcement, and the absurdity of their threat was starting to break through their facade. The man with the mustache stepped forward, his voice growing more forceful. "We have the authority. You signed the contract when you moved in. Hand over the payment or we'll escalate matters." David's right hand twitched, involuntarily, as he resisted the urge to reach into his pocket for his badge. He needed to keep playing along, at least for now. He wasn't going to let these 2 walk all over him. "I'll be right back," he said smoothly, stepping back inside and closing the door behind him. As soon as the door clicked shut, David's mind went into overdrive. He had to act quickly. These men were definitely con men, and they were taking a dangerous risk by pretending to be law enforcement. But why did they come to him specifically? The question gnawed at him. David walked briskly to his office, eyes scanning the cluttered room. His filing cabinet was locked, but he had a spare key. He quickly unlocked it and pulled out the most important document in his collection, his FBI badge. It was a powerful symbol of authority, one that would send these 2 running for cover. But he wasn't going to just show it to them. He was going to build a case, catch them in the act, and make sure they didn't get away with their scheme. His pulse quickened as he returned to the door, ready to confront them again. He stepped outside and immediately saw the mustached man's tense posture. The tall one stood beside him, clearly growing impatient. They didn't seem like professionals. They looked like amateurs, trying to bluff their way through a crime that was way over their heads. David took a deep breath, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Gentlemen," he said, "I have reason to believe you're not who you say you are. You claim to represent the HOA, but your documents aren't adding up." The tall man shifted uneasily, his eyes darting nervously. "We are who we say we are," he insisted. But his voice quivered slightly, betraying his anxiety. David didn't back down. "You're impersonating law enforcement officers and threatening residents with false arrests. If you think you can get away with this, you're mistaken." The mustached man's face twitched, and he reached for something on his belt. David's heart skipped a beat and his instincts kicked in. Was he reaching for a weapon? It didn't matter. David was ready. In one smooth motion, David pulled out his real FBI badge from his pocket and flashed it in front of them. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said in a low, steady voice. "If you want to arrest me, you'll have to try a whole lot harder than that." The look on their faces was priceless. The color drained from their faces as the realization hit them. They froze, their bravado vanishing in an instant. David stepped forward, his voice cold. "Now put your hands where I can see them." The two men hesitated for a moment, but then under the pressure, they slowly lowered their hands. David's heart was still pounding, but now it was a victory pulse. He had them. "You're under arrest," he said, his tone firm. "Impersonating a law enforcement officer is a serious crime." David Harris stood still, staring at the two men kneeling before him on the grass. His heart was still racing from the adrenaline rush, but his mind was already working on the next steps. These two were not just amateurs. They were criminals pretending to be HOA enforcers. But David knew there was more to this than a simple scam. His years as an FBI director had taught him that nothing was ever as it seemed. There had to be a bigger plan behind their brazen act, and David was determined to get to the bottom of it. He glanced down at the mustached man and the tall one, both of whom were still frozen, hands behind their heads as David had ordered. His FBI badge was now tucked away in his pocket, but the weight of it still hung in the air, giving him the confidence he needed. He knew he had them cornered, but before he made the next move, David needed to be sure there were no surprises. These men weren't the type to give up easily. "Now let's make sure we're all clear," David said in a steady voice, taking a step closer. The mustached man's eyes flickered nervously, but he didn't say a word. The tall one was still staring at the ground, his body stiff as if waiting for something. David could almost hear the wheels turning in the man's head, trying to figure out his next move, but it was too late for that. David moved slowly, carefully checking for weapons. He wasn't taking any chances, especially when dealing with people who had the gall to impersonate law enforcement. His eyes scanned their belts, and there, on the mustached man's side, was a cheap pair of plastic handcuffs. David knew they weren't real. They weren't the kind of handcuffs an officer would carry. Just a flimsy tool for a flimsy scheme. The tall one had a canister of pepper spray, nothing more. No real firearms. That was a small relief, but David couldn't let his guard down. "Impersonating a law enforcement officer is a federal crime," David said, his voice cold, every word hitting with authority. "You both are facing serious charges, but I'm not just going to let you off with a slap on the wrist. You're going to answer for what you've done." The mustached man's face twitched, and for a brief moment, David could see the fear in his eyes. Then just as quickly, the man tried to mask it. But David could tell he was rattled. They were in over their heads, and they knew it. "I don't think you fully understand the gravity of the situation," David continued, his eyes locked on the two men. "You've not only violated the law, but you've also targeted the wrong person. I'm not just some retiree in a quiet neighborhood. I'm a former FBI director. You've made a huge mistake." The mustached man swallowed hard, his throat tight. We didn't mean to," he stammered, his voice shaking. David raised an eyebrow. The man's attempt at backpedaling only made the situation worse. "You didn't mean to?" David echoed, stepping closer. "You thought you could just waltz in here, intimidate me, and get away with it? No, you're going to face the consequences of your actions." Before David could take another step, the tall man suddenly made a move. With surprising strength, he shoved David aside, knocking him off balance. The sudden force almost made David lose his grip on his phone, which was still recording the entire incident. His heart skipped a beat, but he quickly regained his composure. The two men were running now, bolting up from the grass, their legs scrambling to get away. David's instincts kicked in immediately. He wasn't going to let them get away. Not after everything they had done. His pulse raced as he took off after them, calling for Curtis across the street to call. In one weapon, the mustached man and his partner sprinted down the sidewalk, glancing over their shoulders to see if David was catching up. They were panicking now, desperate to escape. But David was close, too close. "Hey," David shouted, pushing himself harder. "You're not getting away this time." The two men made a sharp turn toward the cul-de-sac, and David followed, not allowing them to slip through his fingers. They didn't look back now. They just kept running, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. David's phone was still recording, capturing every moment of their frantic escape. He had them. He had everything he needed to bring them down. As they reached the end of the cul-de-sac, a battered sedan was parked at the curb. The engine roared to life as the tall man yanked open the passenger door. They tumbled into the car, their feet tangled in the rush to get away. The mustached man even lost a shoe, but he didn't care. They were just trying to escape, to get away before David could stop them. The car screeched down the street, ignoring a stop sign and narrowly missing a neighbor's flower bed as it swerved around the corner. David cursed under his breath, knowing he couldn't chase them further. Without risking losing control of the situation, he had to stay focused. He'd already seen enough to put them away. But there was one last thing he needed, the license plate number. He quickly scanned the car as it turned the corner, catching a glimpse of the first 3 digits, J4C. The rest was obscured by mud, but it was enough to give him a starting point. Curtis had already called 911. And David felt a wave of relief wash over him. He didn't need to chase them down on his own. The police were on their way, but he wasn't done yet. He wasn't going to let these men slip through his fingers. David stood still for a moment, breathing heavily. He had them on tape, he had their partial plate, and now the police would take it from here. He knew this wasn't the last time he'd encountered trouble in this quiet neighborhood. But for now he had won. He turned and walked back to his house, his mind already processing the next steps. These men might have escaped for now, but they wouldn't be free for long. David had made sure of that. David Harris stood at the edge of the cul-de-sac, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he watched the taillights of the sedan disappear around the corner. His heart was still pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The chase had been close, too close, but it was far from over. These men weren't just ordinary criminals. They were part of something larger, something more dangerous, and David knew it. They hadn't just come for his neighborhood. They had come for him, but why? As the roar of the engine faded, David's mind raced. He had them on video, he had the partial license plate, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The mystery was just beginning to unfold, and David wasn't about to let these men slip through his fingers. They had dared to test him, and now they were going to face the consequences. He quickly turned to Curtis, who had been standing across the street, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Curtis had made the call to 911, and now David needed him to stay vigilant. "Curtis," David said, his voice firm, "keep an eye out. These guys aren't done yet. They may try to circle back." Curtis nodded, his phone still in his hand. "I'm on it, David," he said, his voice low. He had clearly understood the gravity of the situation. David made his way back to his house, his thoughts racing. His initial instinct was to rush inside, pull up the footage, and get it into the hands of the local authorities as quickly as possible. But he knew that the more immediate danger wasn't just the two men he had just chased down. It was the unknown force behind them. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone with a lot more power and resources than a couple of low-level scammers. Inside, David paced around the living room, trying to connect the dots. He had dealt with his fair share of complex cases, but this one felt different. His training told him to be methodical, to stick to the facts, but his gut told him there was more to the story. He sat down at his desk and pulled out his phone. He needed to review the footage again. Maybe he'd missed something in the heat of the moment. The video was clear. The mustached man and the tall one had been so focused on their intimidation tactics that they hadn't noticed the camera rolling. David watched them carefully, zooming in on their faces. It was the mustached man's eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, that stood out. They weren't the eyes of a petty criminal. They were the eyes of someone who had been trained, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate a situation. This wasn't just a scam. This was a test. David's finger hovered over the screen as the realization hit him. These men had been sent. They had been sent to test him, to see how far they could push him. And if David hadn't been who he was, if he hadn't known exactly how to handle the situation, they would have succeeded. But now they had given themselves away. And the more David watched, the clearer it became. This wasn't just an HOA scam. This was part of a much larger conspiracy, one that he had inadvertently walked into. He immediately forwarded the footage to Detective Lena Cross, the investigator he'd been in touch with earlier. She was sharp, and he knew she would understand the significance of what he had just uncovered. The problem was, Lena didn't have the resources to chase this down on her own. David knew he had to be involved. Just as he was about to make another call, his phone rang. The number was blocked, and David's stomach tightened. He picked up the phone, his grip tight. "David Harris," he answered, his voice steady. "Director Harris, we need to talk," a deep voice said. One that David didn't recognize. "You've uncovered something you weren't supposed to." David's instincts screamed that this was more than just a random call. He could hear the tension in the voice, the underlying threat. "Who is this?" David asked, his voice calm, though every muscle in his body was tensed for what was coming next. "You're a sharp one, Harris," the voice continued, ignoring his question. "But even the sharpest knives can be dulled. You don't know what you're up against. We have eyes everywhere, and we don't take kindly to people poking around where they don't belong." David felt a cold chill run down his spine. The voice on the other end was professional, calm, like a predator playing with its prey. "I'm not afraid of threats," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're not going to intimidate me." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when the voice spoke again, it was almost amused. "We're not trying to intimidate you, David. We're simply informing you. You've got something that doesn't belong to you. And we're coming to collect." The line went dead. David lowered his phone slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. They knew exactly who he was, and they weren't going to let him walk away from this. For the first time in his career, David felt the weight of the situation press down on him. This wasn't just about catching a couple of con men. This was about something much bigger, something that had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for him to stumble upon it. David stood up, his mind made up. He wasn't going to sit back and let this happen. Not while he still had a fight left in him. The chase was far from over. This was just the beginning. And David Harris wasn't about to let these people destroy the peace he had fought so hard to find. He grabbed his coat and headed out the door. There was no turning back now. David Harris stood in the middle of his living room, the phone still heavy in his hand after the strange call. The words echoed in his head. "We're coming to collect." His pulse raced as the adrenaline that had been pumping through his veins for hours now seemed to intensify. There was no more time for second-guessing. The men he had encountered weren't just petty criminals. They were part of something much bigger, and they were making it clear that David was now a target. He turned sharply, grabbing his jacket off the chair and tossing his phone onto the counter. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a simple scam anymore. He had been targeted, and if he didn't act fast, things could spiral out of control in ways he couldn't yet predict. The message was clear. They had sent the fake HOA officers to test him, and now they were coming for him. David's mind raced. He needed to find out more, to dig deeper. They knew who he was, and that meant they knew where to hit him hardest. He couldn't rely on the local authorities alone. This had escalated far beyond that. His training in the FBI had prepared him for dangerous situations. But this was different. He wasn't chasing down criminals who made the mistake of crossing him. He was being hunted by a faceless, powerful enemy that already knew his weaknesses. With a steady breath, David moved to the front door. He had no choice but to confront whatever was coming for him. If they thought they could just intimidate him into submission, they were gravely mistaken. He had faced far worse during his career. Still, the eerie feeling that they were always one step ahead sent a shiver down his spine. His instincts told him to be careful. This could easily turn into something violent. David made his way to his car, the streets of the quiet neighborhood now feeling unnervingly empty. He could hear the hum of the streetlights overhead, their artificial glow casting long shadows on the pavement. He glanced around, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. It was too quiet, almost as if the entire neighborhood had fallen under the influence of the same fear that now gripped him. No one seemed to be out. It was as though the world itself had stopped to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. As he approached the car, David's phone buzzed. He reached for it, heart leaping as he saw the incoming message. It was from Detective Lena Cross. The message was brief. "We found something. You need to come to the station now." David's mind raced. What had Lena found? Did she have any new information that could lead them to the men who had tried to scam him? Or worse, were they already planning their next move? Without a second thought, David slammed the door of his car and started the engine, speeding toward the station. Every turn, every street he passed seemed to grow more tense with anticipation. He could almost hear the sirens in the distance, though there were none, his mind playing tricks on him. He knew what he had to do. He had to find out who was behind this. They were watching him, waiting for him to slip up, and David wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. As he pulled into the police station parking lot, he saw Lena standing outside. Her arms crossed tightly, her expression serious. David parked quickly and got out, walking toward her with urgency. "We need to move fast," Lena said as soon as he approached. "You were right. These men are part of something bigger. We found traces of their operation in multiple cities. This is a network, and they're targeting more than just your neighborhood. It's much worse than we thought." David's stomach tightened. "How do you know all of this? What else have you found?" Lena hesitated, glancing around before speaking. "We intercepted a few communications between them, and there's more. They've been watching you for weeks. They know everything. Where you live, where you work, everything about your past. They've been setting you up for something." David's blood ran cold. It was more than just a few fake HOA officers. This was personal. They had been orchestrating this from the very beginning, and they had used the simplest tactics to get close to him. He wasn't just a target. He was the mark of an entire operation. "We need to move," David said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to find out who's behind this before they make their next move." "They're coming for me, Lena. I can feel it." Lena nodded, her expression hardening. "I'm with you, David, but we're not alone in this. If we're going to take them down, we need to hit them fast and hard." David's mind was already working through the next steps. He needed more than just information. He needed to be proactive. There was no way they were going to sit back and let this happen. These people were dangerous, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Without wasting any more time, David and Lena entered the station, where they immediately began working through the intercepted communications. Every new piece of information only added to the growing threat, revealing a web of deceit and manipulation that stretched far beyond what David had initially thought. But even as they pieced everything together, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The silence around him felt too heavy, too ominous. It wasn't just the criminals that were closing in. It was the darkness that surrounded the entire situation, and David had no intention of letting it consume him. "We're ready," Lena said, snapping David out of his thoughts. "Let's take them down." With that, David nodded and led the charge, knowing full well that the game had just begun. The real fight was only just starting, and he wasn't about to let these people walk away unscathed. He would make sure of it. David Harris stood in front of his home, staring into the night. His heart was still pounding, and the adrenaline that had coursed through him for hours now seemed to settle. But the weight of what had just transpired was far from over. The two imposters had fled, and the police were already working on piecing together the details. But David couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. He could sense that the situation wasn't finished, that whatever was behind this scheme was far bigger than he had anticipated. Curtis, his observant neighbor, had already given his statement to the police and was now pacing nervously on the porch. David could see the concern in his eyes. It wasn't just about the fake HOA officers anymore. It was the looming threat of the shadowy figure behind it all. They had targeted David for a reason, and that reason wasn't simply a scam. It was personal, and David knew that the people responsible wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out quickly, seeing that it was a message from Detective Lena Cross. "We've got a break. Meet me at the station, now." David didn't waste a second. He immediately turned to Curtis, who had stopped pacing and was now looking at him with a mixture of concern and determination. "I've got to go. I'll be back soon," David said, his voice steady despite the tension he felt in his gut. Curtis nodded. "Be careful, David. Whatever this is, it's not over." David didn't have time to respond. He got into his car and drove quickly, his mind already racing through the possibilities. What had Lena found? Had they uncovered more about the operation behind the scam? Or had things escalated even further than he realized? As he pulled into the police station parking lot, David's heart skipped a beat. He knew the stakes were higher than ever before. He had been dealing with petty criminals for most of his career. But now, he was facing something much more dangerous. Something much more sinister. And he had no idea what kind of game they were playing. Inside the station, Lena was waiting for him. She was pacing back and forth, her expression tense. When she saw David, she immediately stopped and walked toward him, urgency in her eyes. "We've got a serious problem," Lena said, her voice low. "This is bigger than we thought. We've traced their communications, and it's all pointing to something much darker." David's stomach churned as Lena continued. "These men weren't just rogue scammers. They've been working with a powerful network. People with connections to some very dangerous individuals. This goes far beyond a neighborhood scam. It's part of a larger scheme that's been going on for years, and it's clear they've been watching you." David's mind was racing. He had known it deep down that something was off, but now the reality of it hit him full force. He wasn't just a victim. He had been chosen, and the people behind this had been carefully orchestrating this from the very beginning. "We've got to move fast," David said, determination flooding his chest. "We need to hit them before they make their next move. They've already made it clear they're coming for me." Lena nodded, her expression hardening. "You're right, but we can't do this alone. We need backup, and we need to get ahead of them before they realize we're on to them." David and Lena quickly went over their plan of action, gathering as much intel as they could from the intercepted communications. The network they were dealing with wasn't just operating locally, it was national, perhaps even international, and it had its fingers in more pies than David could have ever imagined. This wasn't just about taking down a few conmen. It was about stopping an entire criminal enterprise from moving forward. As they prepared to go over their next steps, David's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from an unknown number. His stomach tightened. Could it be them? Was the enemy closing in? He answered the phone without hesitation. "David Harris," he said, his voice steady despite the growing unease. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "I hope you're enjoying your little investigation, Director. But let's be clear, this is bigger than you. You think you can stop us? You don't even know who you're dealing with. We've got eyes everywhere." David's blood ran cold. He had been right all along. These people were dangerous. But they weren't just targeting him. They had a network, a powerful one. And now they were making it personal. "I'm not afraid of threats," David replied, his voice sharp. "But if you think you can keep me out of this, you're wrong. I'm coming for you, and you won't get away with it." The line went dead. David's grip tightened on the phone as he felt the weight of the threat sink in. They were playing for keeps now. Lena was already moving, grabbing her coat and heading toward the door. "We've got work to do," she said. "Let's take this down once and for all." David nodded, his resolve hardening. The game had just escalated, and he wasn't going to let them win. Not now, not ever. As they left the station, David's mind was clear. He was no longer just reacting to what was happening. He was going to take control. He was going to find these people and stop them before they could do any more damage. And he would make sure that the quiet retirement he had been hoping for would never be disturbed again, because, from now on, David Harris was the one who would be doing the hunting. The storm was just beginning, and David was ready